I asked Mike to read from Genesis chapter 4 because near the dawn of time, Cain asked the immortal question, "Am I my brother's keeper?" And the biblical answer that has come ringing down throughout the centuries is yes. The Bible clearly tells us that we have a responsibility to our fellow man. But what is that responsibility? What obligation do I have to my neighbor? Well, I believe the Apostle Paul answers that question in Romans chapter 13, beginning in verse 8, when he writes, "Owe no one anything except to love one another. For he who loves another has fulfilled the law. For the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, you shall not covet, and if there is any other commandment, are all summed up in this saying, namely, you shall love your neighbor as yourself." Love does no harm to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. Ladies and gentlemen, that little word "owe" speaks of responsibility. Paul said, "Owe no one anything except to love one another." And I hope that you can see that in this passage, the Apostle Paul sums up the Christian's responsibility to his fellow man with that one single word, love. Love for my neighbor will not allow me to commit adultery with my neighbor's wife. It will not allow me to take the life of my neighbor or to steal from my neighbor what belongs to him. It will not even allow me to covet that which belongs to my neighbor. Paul explains that love is the fulfillment of law because love does not harm others. May I suggest to you that this really means that love works good to other people. In Jesus' story of the Good Samaritan, the priest and the Levite did not harm the man lying beside the road who had been beaten and left for dead, but they certainly did him no good. It was the Samaritan who truly showed love for that man on that occasion. The Bible teaches that love will do everything that it can to help and nothing to hurt. And I'm sure that you already know that the Bible sums up the Christian's responsibility not only to his neighbor but to God himself with that one little word, love. Matthew writes in Matthew chapter 22, beginning in verse 34, "But when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together. Then one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question, testing him and saying, 'Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law?' Jesus said, 'You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets.'" Jesus teaches that I must love God. He quotes from Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 and 5, and that particular passage is quoted or alluded to at least 3 different times in the New Testament. And Jesus explains that loving God is the first and the great commandment in the law. And then Jesus quotes Leviticus chapter 19 and verse 18. And he explains that loving one's neighbor as oneself is the second greatest commandment. I find it interesting that that passage, Leviticus 19:18, is quoted or alluded to at least 9 times in the New Testament. The Jewish Talmud lists 613 commandments in the law of Moses. 365 negative commands, 248 positive commands, and I don't know how they came up with that list, but that was their list, 613 commandments in the law of Moses, and Jesus sums them all up in just 2, love God and love your neighbor. And so, ladies and gentlemen, the songwriters are correct when they say what the world needs now is love, sweet love. It's the only thing that there's just too little of. What the world needs now is love, sweet love. No, not just for some, but for everyone. The songwriters were correct when they said, come on people now, smile on your brother, everybody get together, try to love one another right now. What we need in this old world of ours is love. But more than that, we need to really understand what real love really is. In our society today, love is one of the most ambiguous of all concepts. We sing about it, we talk about it, we dream about it, but we don't seem to know all that much about it, really. And this ambiguity is evidenced in the way we try to define it and talk about it. The old movie Love Story said love is never having to say you're sorry. Well, let me tell you folks, that's just as wrong as it can be. I like this definition. Love is an itchy feeling around the heart that you can't scratch. And I like this one. Love is the feeling you feel when you feel you're going to feel a feeling that you've never felt before. And somebody says love is the inward inexpressibility of an outward all-overreachness. We use the word love to talk about a whole range of feelings, emotions, and attitudes. We love just about everything under the sun. The country music fans in this audience Those who are fans of old classic country, like myself, will remember Tom T. Hall's song entitled, I Love. And he sang, I love little baby ducks, old pickup trucks, slow-moving trains, and rain. I love little country streams, sleep without dreams, Sunday school in May, and hay. And I love you too. And it just goes on and on. I love Mountain Dew and popcorn. And I love old movies, the old black and white movies. Mark thinks an old movie goes back to the 70s or 80s. No, I'm talking about the 30s and the 40s and on up. I love old movies. "30, 40, 50 years ago, the ladies loved Elvis. And a little bit more recently, they loved Tom Cruise. And I don't know who the current heartthrob is, but I'm trying to illustrate the fact that we use the word love to describe a whole host of feelings and emotions. We need love, all right, but we need to understand what biblical love really is. And so we're going to do two things in our sermon this morning. We're going to analyze the second commandment, put it under the microscope, and look at it carefully. And then we'll conclude our study by mentioning some ways that we can apply the second commandment in our lives. And so I want to begin by urging you to think carefully about the first word of that second commandment. Jesus said, you shall love. You know what that means? That means that Jesus was talking to me, and He was talking to you. He was talking to Mark and Lisa and John and Diana and Janice and Holly. He was talking to each and every person in this assembly this morning who can listen to this sermon with understanding. Jesus was talking to you. This statement applies to all. There are no exceptions. There are no exemptions. And then think about that second word, you shall. Well, this indicates that this is a command from God. You shall. Jesus told the disciples in John chapter 13, verse 34 and 35, a new commandment I give to you, that you love one another as I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this all will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. Now, there is a very real sense in which the command to love was certainly not new in the time of Jesus. After all, as I have already mentioned, Jesus quoted Leviticus chapter 19 and verse 18, and He identified that as the second commandment. Leviticus was written some 1,400 years before Jesus entered our world. And so the command to love was not new in the time of Jesus, but its nature was new. Please notice that in John 13, Jesus does not instruct us to love others as we love ourselves, but rather to love others as I have loved you. You see, Jesus places an urgency and an intensity on the command to love that was not there before. He raises the bar. I'm not just to love others as I love myself. I am to love others as Jesus loves me. And he tells us that that kind of love will be an identifying mark of true discipleship. That's how Jesus says the world will know that you're one of my disciples. In John chapter 15 and verse 12, Jesus says, "This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you." We must not overlook those words, my commandment. This is a commandment from the Lord Jesus Christ himself. A commandment from the one who has loved the entire world with the greatest kind of love that the world has ever known. Other passages tell us that husbands are to love their wives as Christ loved the church. Other passages indicate that we are to love even our enemies. We are commanded to love our brethren. We are instructed to love our neighbor. And that means that this is not a suggestion. It's not just a recommendation or a piece of good advice. Jesus does not say, love your neighbor if you want to. If it's convenient, if you've got the time, if he's worthy of your love, if it doesn't hurt too much, if you feel like it. Jesus says none of that. Jesus says, love your neighbor. And ladies and gentlemen, the fact that this is a command from God indicates that this is something that I can do. It really is possible for me to love my neighbor. God would not require us to do something that we can't do. He's not going to command me to do the impossible. And that means that it's possible for me to love my neighbor with the kind of love that Paul contemplates in Romans chapter 13. And that means, ladies and gentlemen, that I control whether or not I love my neighbor. Contrary to popular opinion, biblical love is not just something that happens or it doesn't happen. I choose. I determine. I decide to love my neighbor. And that means that this kind of love involves a commitment of the mind and the will. It is not just, and I'm saying that very carefully, it is not just an emotional response. I used to tell folks, well, you can't command an emotion. You can't command the heart to go pitter-patter and the stomach to flop over 3 times. When I was in college, there was a young lady that my dad thought that I really ought to be interested in because, as Daddy put it, she's such a sweet-turned girl. I guess I've told this story before, maybe? Well, you're going to hear it again. And I told Dad, she just doesn't ring my bell. And Daddy said, well, I think your clapper's broke. I used to tell folks you can't command an emotion, but then I ran across an article that pointed out something to me that I had overlooked, and that is there are times when God commands an emotional response. Paul repeatedly commanded the Philippians to rejoice in the Lord. And Paul commanded the Romans to be kindly affectionate to one another. And Peter tells us that brotherly kindness is one of the virtues that we're to add to our lives. So I guess it's not really accurate to say you can't command an emotion. The kind of love that we're talking about this morning does not exclude emotion, but it often runs counter to them. Jesus commands us to love our enemies, but I don't think he expects us to like them necessarily. If I'm right about that, that means that you can really love someone that you don't even like. The novelist F. Scott Fitzgerald told his daughter in a letter that he wrote to her, "It was fine seeing you, and I liked you a lot." And then he said parenthetically, "This is aside from loving you, which I always do." He seemed to grasp the fact that there is a difference between liking and loving, and you can love people that you don't even like. And then think with me about that word love. As I've already suggested, the English language is somewhat impoverished when it comes to talking about the concept of love because we have just one word to talk about a whole range of feelings and emotions and attitudes. The Greeks had 4 different words. There was the word erao or eros, which was sexual love. That's not the word that Bible writers use. There was the word storge, which suggests family love, the kind of love that parents and children have for one another, the kind of love that brothers and sisters have. It's the love of kith and kin, we might say. But that's not the word that Jesus or Paul uses. And then there were the words phileo, the verb form, and philia, the noun form, which speaks of friendly love. Our English words Philadelphia and philanthropy are derived from those Greek words. And I have read that it was the highest word for love in secular Greek. It described the kind of love between friends who have a great deal in common with one another. A warm, intimate, tender relationship of body, mind, and spirit. But that's not the word that Paul uses. As you know, Paul uses the word agapao, the verb form, and the noun form agape, which refers to grace love. Well, what kind of love is that? William Barclay, in his little book, Flesh and Spirit, where he talks about the works of the flesh and the fruit of the Spirit, he has this to say about this word agape. He says, the meaning of agape is unconquerable benevolence, undefeatable goodwill. Agape is the spirit in the heart which will never seek anything but the highest good of its fellow man. It does not matter how its fellow men treat it. It does not matter what and who its fellow men are. It does not matter what their attitude is to it. It will never seek anything but their highest and their best good. Mr. Barclay went on to say, Plato said, love is for the lovely. But the distinguishing quality of Christian love lies precisely in its obligation and its ability to love the unlovely and the unlovable, to seek the man's highest good quite independently of what the man is or is doing or has done. In Christian love, the idea of merit has passed out of sight. This kind of love is a love of the undeserving and the utterly unworthy. Mr. Barclay goes on to say, it has indeed been said that in at least one of its aspects, agape is the ability and the power and the determination to love the people we do not like. Well, obviously, that's the deepest and the highest kind of love there is. That's the kind of love that God has manifested towards sinners like you and me. And I would suggest to you that if we are to learn this kind of love, we're going to have to learn it from our great God. John writes in 1 John 4, verse 7 and 8, Beloved, let us love one another, for love is of God, and everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. He who does not love does not know God, for God is love. In other words, this kind of love is the product of deity. No wonder the Apostle Paul heads the list that he identifies as the fruit of the Spirit with this word love. Ladies and gentlemen, the importance of this kind of love for our fellow man cannot be overemphasized. It's not the first commandment, but it is the second. Only loving God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength is more important than loving our neighbor as we love ourselves. And in the 13th chapter of 1 Corinthians, the Apostle Paul explains that loving others is so important that even sacrificial acts of service are meaningless without it. Listen to his words. Though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I have become sounding brass or a clanging cymbal. And though I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and though I have all faith so that I could remove mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. And though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned, but have not love, it profits me Nothing. Well, to highlight what this kind of love is all about, let's think about what Paul says about it in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. He says, first of all, that love suffers long. As I mentioned in our 9 o'clock study, this means that love is literally long-tempered. This word denotes patience with people rather than patience with things or circumstances. It's the state of mind that can bear long when oppressed, provoked, or mistreated. Love suffers long even when it hurts. I appreciate the words of C.S. Lewis in his little book, The Four Loves. He says, there is no safe investment. To love at all is to be vulnerable. Love anything and your heart will certainly be wrung and possibly be broken. If you want to make sure of keeping it intact, you must give your heart to no one, not even to an animal. Wrap it carefully round with hobbies and little luxuries. Avoid all entanglements. Lock it up safe in the casket or coffin of your selfishness. But in that casket, safe, dark, motionless, airless, it will change. It will not be broken. It will become unbreakable, impenetrable, irredeemable. The alternative to tragedy, or at least to the risk of tragedy, is damnation. The only place outside heaven where you can be perfectly safe from all the dangers and perturbations of love is hell. Let me tell you, folks, it ain't easy to love people. You're going to get your heart tromped on. You're going to get your teeth kicked in. But this kind of love derives its very essence from the man of sorrows. Paul says love is kind. It's good-natured, it's gentle, it's tender, it's affectionate, it's mellow, it's caring. Harshness and roughness and bitterness are banished by love. The early Christian writer Origen said love is sweet to all. And this concept was diametrically opposed to the concept of the pagans. The pagans taught, teach yourself not to care. Christ teaches, teach yourself to care passionately and intensely for men. Paul says love does not envy. It's not jealous. It doesn't envy other people's health or wealth or talents or beauty or reputation or success or anything else. And Paul says love does not parade itself. It does not act like a braggart. It is not a windbag. It does not think more highly of itself than it should. It doesn't show off. It doesn't look for the limelight. There is a self-effacing quality to biblical love. Paul says love is not puffed up. You see, love destroys not just the feeling of pride, but also every expression of pride as well. Love doesn't talk big, and it doesn't think big either. It is concerned with giving itself rather than asserting itself. Paul says, love does not behave rudely. It does not act disgracefully, dishonorably, indecently, improperly, or unbecomingly. Love does nothing to raise a blush. It does not seek its own. Folks, selfishness is the root of all sin. In fact, the fundamental choice in life is the choice between God and self. That was Eve's fundamental choice in the very beginning. It's my choice every day. It's your choice every day. Sin is a little bitty word with a great big I smack dab in the middle of it. I hope you'll remember that. Sin is a little bitty word with a great big I smack dab in the middle of it. Selfishness is my biggest problem. And I can say that without much hesitation because I've got a sneaking suspicion that it's your biggest problem too. Paul says love is not provoked. It's not irritable. It's not touchy. It doesn't easily take offense. When I read this description, I think of that TV commercial with Robert Conrad years ago where he was advertising ever-ready batteries, and he had a battery here on his shoulder, and he's asking somebody to knock it off. Anybody remember those commercials besides me? Love doesn't walk around with a chip on its shoulder. It doesn't easily become exasperated with people. It is tolerant. Paul says love thinks no evil. That means love doesn't keep score. Reminds me of the story of the fellow that was having problems with his wife, and he went to a counselor, and he said, well, every time we have a fight, my wife gets hysterical. And the counselor said, don't you mean hysterical? And he said, no, I mean historical. She brings up all the bad things I've done in the past. Love doesn't bear a grudge. Love doesn't rejoice in iniquity. It finds no pleasure in sin. It does not rejoice over the vices of others, nor does it delight when they fall into sin. Now, don't misunderstand me. True love will not ignore the sin in the lives of other people. It will not look the other way. Paul says love rejoices in the truth. It seems to me that perhaps Paul is personifying love and truth here, and he is saying, in effect, truth is rejoicing, and love is right there rejoicing with it. True love does not desire to veil the truth. It has nothing to conceal. It is glad when the truth prevails, and it bears all things. That might mean a couple of things. It might mean that love covers all things. It might mean that love endures all things. Paul says it believes all things. Now, Paul is not saying that love is gullible. But he's saying that love is not suspicious. It's not looking for the boogeyman behind every bush. It's not cynical and pessimistic. Love looks for the best even in the worst. And when there is no evidence to the contrary, it believes the best of its fellow man. Paul says, love hopes all things, even when the evidence is conclusive that a man can't be trusted. Love hopes for the best anyway. Paul says love endures all things. That's not talking about some kind of passive resignation, but rather an active, positive fortitude. Love is not overwhelmed, but it manfully plays its part, whatever the difficulties. And when hopes are repeatedly disappointed, love still courageously endures. And then finally, Paul says, love never fails. Biblical love is unconquerable. And then Paul says, love your neighbor. And of course, the story of the Good Samaritan recorded in Luke chapter 10 tells me that my neighbor is anyone who needs my help that I can help. Rich man, poor man, beggar man, thief, the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, red and yellow, black and white, my neighbor is anyone, anywhere who needs my help that I can help. And then Paul says, as yourself. We take pretty good care of ourselves, don't we? Kathy will tell you that when I'm sick, I like lots of TLC. I like the chicken noodle soup and the whole 9 yards. We take care of ourselves. And this is the essence of what we commonly call the golden rule. Jesus said, therefore, whatever you want men to do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets. Well, how can we apply the second commandment? I'm just going to mention 4 things quickly, and then we'll be through. We need to apply the second commandment by helping needy people. We have that responsibility. Paul told the Galatians in Galatians 6 verse 10, therefore as we have opportunity, let us do good to all, especially to those who are of the household of faith. We can and we should apply the second commandment by praying for all. Paul told Timothy in 1 Timothy 2, therefore I exhort first of all that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and giving of thanks be made for all men. And then he goes on to specify governmental officials. We need to apply the second commandment by teaching the lost. We are debtors, are we not? Someone taught us Are we not obligated, therefore, to share the gospel with others as we have the ability and the opportunity to do that? And then finally, I would suggest to you that we need to apply the second commandment by warning the wayward. That is an act of love as well. Jude writes in verse 22 and 23 of his short letter, "And have mercy on some who are doubting. Save others, snatching them out of the fire, and on some have mercy with fear, hating even the garment polluted by the flesh." It really is true that the Christian's responsibility to his fellow man can be summed up in the one word, love. So, how you doing? Paul told the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 16:14, "Let all that you do be done in love." May the Lord help us keep the first and the second commandment. We're going to stand and sing our invitation hymn to give anyone in this assembly the opportunity to respond to the gospel. If your life is not right with the Lord and you know that, and you know what you need to do to be right with Him, then we urge you to take advantage of this opportunity. And we would be honored to help you in any way that we can. You can come right now as we stand and we sing.